Hello everybody, welcome to the presentation dedicated to one of the most important events of the second half of the 20th century. That was the Cold War, the confrontation between the Soviet Union and the United States. A particular emphasis will be placed on the Vietnam War, which was one of the most important aspects or events during this confrontation. I have prepared this show with the participation of a group of my favorite students from the Pedagogical University in Krakow.
Hi, I'm Mikołaj and I'll be giving you a short summary of what the Vietnam War was basically about.
Hi, I'm Asia. I will be talking about the role of media in the conflict.
Hello, I'm Kamil and my part of the presentation is focused on the Vietnam War in culture.
Hello, I'm Bartek. I'll be your military specialist. In my segment, I will show you some original equipment from the period.
In 1945, Germany was defeated and finally surrendered as the main aggressor in the Second World War. Very soon, the wartime alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union began to unravel. In the late 1940s, the Soviet installed communist governments in the occupied countries of Eastern Europe that had been liberated by the Red Army. The Americans and the Western partners realized the potential threat of Soviet-influenced communist parties coming to power in Western democracies. As a result, the world became divided into two competing political, ideological and military blocs. Western democracies remained under the influence of the United States, and communist regimes were supported by the Soviet Union. This confrontation became known as the Cold War. The Cold War was waged on political, economic and propaganda fronts. The Cold War became the hottest, as it were, between 1948 to 1953 and effectively lasted until the collapse of the Berlin Wall in 1989. During this period, there was a number of critical events that shaped the politics and the confrontation between the West and the East. So, here is a list of such events, no important ones. For instance, number one was the unsuccessful blockade of West Berlin between 1948 and 1949 by the Soviets. Another crucial event was the formation of NATO, aiming at resisting the Soviet presence in Europe. NATO was formed in 1949. Then there were Soviet-supported communist governments of North Korea invading US-supported South Korea in 1950. That resulted in the Korean War. Then another incident was the formation of the Warsaw Pact in 1955. And also very important, the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. That was a direct confrontation that brought the two superpowers, two competing blocs, to the brink of war before an agreement was reached to withdraw the missiles. And eventually, the Vietnam War that lasted over a decade, beginning in 1964 and eventually ending in 1975. In the course of the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union avoided direct military confrontation in Europe, preventing the Allies from changing sides. The Soviet Union sent troops to preserve communist rule in East Germany in 1953, Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968. The United States, on the other hand, intervened in Guatemala in 1954, supported an unsuccessful invasion of Cuba in 1961 and invaded the Dominican Republic in 1965 and Grenada in 1983. On top of that, the United States undertook a long and unsuccessful effort to prevent communist North Vietnam from bringing South Vietnam under the rule, thus starting the long and costly Vietnam War, a topic we are going to elaborate upon in the later section of our video. In the 1960s and the 1970s, this confrontation between the blocs became more complicated and the world was no longer divided into two clearly opposed sides. A period of renewed Cold War tensions occurred in the early 1980s as the United States and the Soviet Union increased the arms buildup, entering the competition for influence in the Third World countries. The Cold War began to break down towards the end of the 1980s when Mikhail Gorbachev started to democratize the Soviet political system. The rise to power of democratic governments in Central and Eastern Europe was followed by the unification of East and West Germany. Gorbachev's reforms had weakened not only the Communist Party in the Soviet Union, but the whole country. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed and 15 newly independent nations were established. The Cold War had come to an end.
For the United States, the whole point of the Cold War was to stop communism from spreading at all costs, as Americans were genuinely terrified of the possibility that one day it may simply grow out of control. And so, after World War II had ended, and it became a real possibility that North Vietnam might actually win its struggle against South Vietnam, and as a result, the entire nation of Vietnam would become communist, it wasn't surprising that the United States decided to step in. Little did they know that the Vietnam War was going to end up the biggest disaster for the United States in the entirety of the Cold War. But let's start from the start. All of the early involvement from the US revolved mainly around air support, which in practice meant bombing, and a lot of bombing, as the Vietnam War witnessed more bombs being dropped than during the entirety of World War II. Additionally, the US also used napalm and defoliants to clear the jungles below. Though all of this was quite costly, and to justify the costs of all of these expeditions, the US authorities continuously assured their people that they were actually this close to victory and that they were decisively crushing the communists. Yet, with all of that bombing, still the North Vietnamese were not stepping down. Eventually, this led to Lyndon B. Johnson having to send the US troops to Vietnam, which he did in '65. Having to, because the United States could not lose to communism, and especially not with how much they were promising they were winning. At its peak, 500,000 US troops were present in Vietnam, and this sounds really formidable, but we have to remember that Vietnam was not trench warfare. Instead, this was a hardly penetrable jungle, limiting mobility to the point of only 30 meters, taking upwards of an hour to traverse. And additionally, North Vietnamese would lay booby traps and landmines and pester the US troops with grenades to weaken them significantly before any engagement. That meant that though that 500,000 sounded formidable, in practice, they were much more powerless than imagined. And because mobility was so scarce, any terrain secured by the US would be recaptured very quickly, and so troops were ordered to instead employ a policy of attrition, which in practice meant just kill what you see. And the jungle made it so it was often very difficult to tell whether what one saw was a Vietnamese soldier or a civilian. Too often, the distinction was not attempted at all, leading to massive civilian kill counts, especially as the US used body counts to determine whether they were winning. Ergo, as long as more Vietnamese were dead than us, we were good. Something else that sets the Vietnam War apart from other contemporary conflicts was that it was actually transmitted back to the US public, including the aforementioned mass bombings, jungle fighting, and even reports of actual massacres, like the infamous My Lai massacre, where the US troops murdered more than 350 unarmed civilians. In light of such revelations, much of the public swayed against their government and started protesting as they saw that not only is this war just truly dreadful, but also because they suspected that maybe the US was not actually that close to victory after all. Meanwhile, on the front line, the same trend continued, as the efforts were not really bringing any desired results, and so the morals of the US troops started to drop too, as they saw that though the South Vietnamese had fighting spirit, as they were fighting for their own country, the Americans not so much, as they were fighting an abstract against communism, and so many of them eventually started protesting and stopped fighting. And so, with the combined uproar of both the US public at home and the US troops in Vietnam, Richard Nixon, who vowed to have a plan for ending the Vietnam War somehow, was elected in high hopes. And though the Vietnam War is mostly known as Johnson's War, as he was the one to initiate American bombings and send the US troops in, Richard Nixon also took over late, and his plan was as such. Firstly, he devised a plan called Vietnamization, meaning slowly placing more and more responsibility on the South Vietnamese soldiers, while taking the US troops home batch by batch. In exchange for this, South Vietnam would receive additional equipment to be able to keep on fighting, and also their troops would be additionally trained. The second part of the plan was more bombing, with the campaign being coined Christmas bombing and having killed roughly 1,600 civilians. The plan did what it was supposed to do. The bombings forced an agreement, and the American troops were able to safely return home, with the last batch returning in 1973. Meanwhile, it was pretty clear that if South Vietnam was not able to win, with 500,000 US troops at their disposal, they were not going to stand a chance on their own. And indeed, in 1975, South Vietnam surrendered, and the Communist North was victorious. And this is the first true loss for the United States in history, and it was a very costly one. Over $100 billion spent, over 58,000 American lives lost. And communism still prevailed. And just as importantly, the trust the US public once held for its government was also forever gone. And this was in no small part thanks to the media.
This rifle was designed by Eugene Stoner in the late 1950s, based on a prototype called the AR-15. When this rifle was introduced into the Army's equipment, it soon turned out that it had defects such as jamming, which caused many losses among American soldiers. After that, designers developed new solutions to eliminate these defects. Despite a difficult start, the design based on the M16A1 proved to be successful and therefore became the basis for many rifles created to this day. M60 rifle was created to replace the large and heavy Browning M1919 machine gun. In the 1956 tests, M60 prototype proved to be more mobile, reliable and have better range. A year later it was introduced to the Army. It was the main firepower of the infantry rifle section, providing an advantage in the close-range fighting. It was nicknamed Pig due to its size and weight about 11 kilograms. The ammunition was carried by several troops, and each of them carried at least 100 rounds. It was often used in a light role in a bipod, but also as a protective armament on vehicles and helicopters. M26A1 was a standard fragmentation hand grenade. It was shaped like a lemon, hence its nickname, lemon grenade. It weighed 450 grams and was filled with 1/3 of explosives. An average soldier could throw it at a distance of 40 meters. The effective blast radius was 15 meters, and the effective radius causing fatalities was 5 meters. Despite that, the grenade fragments could also scatter as far as 230 meters.
The Vietnam conflict is often called the first television war. Video footage of Vietnam was quickly transmitted and edited, allowing Americans to be instantly updated on the course of the war. Yet, the role of media in this matter is a rather controversial topic. Some argue that uncensored battle footage and a negative narrative contributed to lowering support for the military actions among Americans. However, if we look at the news before the year 1968, we will learn that most of the reports were actually supportive, and so was the general attitude of the public. But media is not just television. Newspapers have played a big role in America, especially one scandal due to Daniel Ellsberg, who leaked Pentagon papers to the Washington Post, New York Times and some other newspapers. Daniel Ellsberg was a United States military analyst working under Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. In 1971, Daniel released a top-secret Pentagon study on history of United States government decision-making in relation to the war. These reports included accounts of many mishandlings on the part of the Americans, as well as examples of authorities openly lying to the public about the war and withholding information from them. The information contained in the papers concerned the fact that the US, instead of withdrawing the troops, was actually expanding the war with 1969 bombings of Cambodia and Laos, coastal raids on North Vietnam, and Marine Corps attacks, none of which had been reported by the American media. There were examples of Presidents Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy and Johnson openly lying to the public listed, examples of Eisenhower administration actively working against the Geneva Accords, official confession that the war in Vietnam was not about guaranteeing a better, freer way of life for South Vietnamese, as was pictured in the media, but about avoiding humiliating American defeat. Another example was the fact that President Johnson knew he would be sending more troops to Vietnam right from the start, although he was saying otherwise during his campaign. Well, one can imagine that after such a scandal, support for the war decreased dramatically. The full report was released in 2011 and contained 7,000 pages divided into 47 volumes. But what happened to Daniel Ellsberg? He was charged under the Espionage Act and other charges including theft and conspiracy. All charges amounted to a maximum sentence of 115 years, but the federal espionage laws targeted those who provided classified information to foreign governments, not those who gave documents to members of Congress or the American press. There were also controversies of wiretapping Ellsberg and his attorney, as well as stealing his psychiatrist files. Hence, the court ruled a dismissal of all charges based on the government's misconduct.
This helmet's design was field-proven and used as early as World War II. The helmet consisted of two parts, an outer steel shell and a liner, which was a smaller helmet made of plastic, often worn at base and during parades. The helmet featured a cover with two reversible camouflage patterns, the darker one with the clouds pattern used in autumn and the vine leaf pattern used in Vietnam. The helmet consisted of two parts, an outer steel shell and a liner, which was a smaller helmet made of plastic, often worn at the base and during parades. The helmet was also wrapped with elastic band with which the soldier could attach additional equipment such as insect repellent, gun oil or first aid packets. This basic uniform was introduced in 1963 and had three variants, all of them made of cotton. The last of them, introduced in 1966, used a different sewing design called ripstop. This sewing pattern was previously used in a parachute production as it prevented the fabric from tearing. The first uniforms made using the ripstop method were actually made during Vietnam War. As for the boots, there were 5 variants of them. The first 2 were made of leather, often used by pilots and vehicle operators. Then there were variants called jungle boots, which were made of leather and nylon. This combination, along with these holes in the boots, allowed feet to dry quickly, which was very important in the wet climate of the rainforest. LCE. This is the name of the gear system that was worn by American soldiers. The equipment included a pistol belt connected to suspenders that formed the base of all web gear. The rifleman had a universal ammo pouch containing 3 magazines, each for the M16A1, a canteen, and a field pack in which he could place the most necessary items like additional socks, food, or first aid packets.
The 60s was a period of major changes, revolutions, and divisions in American society as well as culture. The assassination of JFK, landing on the moon, Stonewall riots, March on Washington, signing of the Civil Rights Act, these are all significant events that took place or were in progress at that time. As the 1960s progressed, social tensions regarding issues such as women's rights, sexuality, and racial segregation were becoming widespread. However, these were not the only issues that the US government had to resolve. The growing financial discrepancy between Americans, especially between white and black citizens, was becoming a major concern. The national poverty rate at that time, that is 1964, was around 19%. Thus, JFK's successor, Johnson, declared the War on Poverty, a social welfare legislation that aimed at creating a great society by attempting to reduce or even end poverty in America. Unsurprisingly, it further deepened the divisions present in American society, as the white working class and lower middle class felt that the government favored the minorities and did not understand their needs. To make matters worse, America was waging a futile war in Vietnam that cost $27 billion annually and substantially limited the effectiveness of the program. The high cost of the war, combined with the gruesome images of the conflict on television and the increasing death toll of American soldiers, united the opponents of the conflict. The aforementioned social tensions and the Vietnam War resulted in the rise of the counterculture movement that rioted against those issues. At the front of the new movement were young men and women, mostly college students, united under the slogan "Make love, not war." The group was characterized by its willingness to experiment with drugs, usually marijuana and LSD, casual fashion, and expressing their feelings through rock and folk music. These people were referred to as hippies or flower children. As one of the major uniting factors of the counterculture movement in the 60s was music, it is important to examine a few of the greatest hits of that era. When Buffalo Springfield released For What It's Worth in 1967, the song that immediately topped the charts in the US and was played across every radio station in America. Even though the song was written to highlight the protests against the curfew in Hollywood, it became one of the anthems against the Vietnam War, with lyrics that tackle issues such as civilian suppression and encourage listeners to acknowledge the current problems troubling the nation. Another famous anti-war song of that period was Fortunate Son, released in 1969 by Creedence Clearwater Revival. The song's lyrics directly address the Vietnam War, especially the unfairness of the conflict regarding the drafts. The titular Fortunate Son is a child of a wealthy man that would never be sent to war, whereas those less fortunate ones are drafted and killed in a mindless conflict. Fortunate Son has become the song that most people associate with the Vietnam War and was featured in many films and video games. There are even accounts of soldiers listening to it at the front lines. Both Buffalo Springfield and Creedence Clearwater Revival were featured in the 1969 Woodstock lineup. Gathering many of the most prolific artists of the period, the festival had a capacity crowd of 200,000. When the festival began, more than 500,000 turned up at the venue. The organizers decided to open the event to everyone free of charge. Today, Woodstock stands as a symbol of the era. When censorship became milder, it allowed filmmakers to present more complex human relations as well as address and reflect contemporary social concerns of the period in their works. One of the first films to present the social concerns of Americans in the 60s was Stanley Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove, released in 1964. The film is a dark comedy that reflects and captures the fear of nuclear threat that escalated during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. The film's satire is aimed at the theory of mutual assured distraction, according to which a country attacked with nuclear weapons would counterattack with atomic bombs as well, in fact causing the annihilation of both sides. Another anti-war film by Kubrick, Full Metal Jacket, deals with the Vietnam conflict. It shows a group of young Marines who are trained by a sadistic Sergeant Hartman who brainwashes them into becoming mindless killers. Once the group is deployed at the front, the film focuses on showing how devastating the war is on the character's mental stability. In addition to that, it shows soldiers as a resource used by governments rather than human beings. Francis Ford Coppola's Apocalypse Now, released in 1979, is the adaptation of The Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. The film focuses on the imperialism of the United States in Vietnam, where American soldiers act as if they own the land they are deployed in. Instead of bringing democracy, they bring destruction and death. In addition to that, just like Conrad's novel, the film is a journey that unravels the darkest parts of the human psyche in the face of war. One of the prominent themes in Vietnam War films was the mental health of war veterans. First Blood tells a story of a soldier, John Rambo, who returns home from war and doesn't fit in the post-war reality. Not only is he mentally broken, but also the people around him treat him poorly to say the least. He is an outcast. Rambo might physically be back in the US, but his tormented mind is still back in Vietnam.
The M1969 vest was an improved version of the M1952 vest used during the Korean War. Its ballistic padding's main function was not to protect against bullets, but against grenade fragments. Unlike the previous model, the vest featured a built-in collar for neck protection. This backpack, introduced in 1966, consisted of a waterproof nylon bag with one large pocket and 3 outer pockets. The backpack was attached to a tube-shaped aluminum frame. Some equipment could also be attached to the backpack, including canteens, ponchos, machetes, sleeping bags, tents, grenades, and infantry spades. The US Army started using PRC-10 radio transceivers during the Korean War in 1951. They were sent to the South Vietnam as part of military assistance programs in the late 1950s and early 1960s, mainly to the Civilian Self-Defense Corps and Civil Guard. In 1965, they began to be replaced by PRC-25s. As you might guess, the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army used many captured PRC-10s in their own networks.
Well, this is the end of our presentation. We hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you.